Hello. Welcome back. This is the first lesson of the first week of year two. And if you've been reading the emails and things I've put on Classroom, then you'll see that what we're trying to do is start two new topics. And this first one is all about socialism. So I'm going to take you through what we talked about this morning in our Google Live session, and probably in about 10 minutes, maybe slightly more as well. And hopefully that'll mean that if you missed the session because you had a driving lesson or something like that, then at least you'll be able to catch up straight away. Okay, so I won't bother doing all the recap things that we did about American politics and other chit-chat that we had about what people have done after the summer. Let's get straight to socialism. So, this course is organised like the other ones, like liberalism and conservatism and feminism, which we're going to look at later on in the week, basically across 12 lessons. And those 12 lessons are grouped around what socialists agree on, and then some of the differences between different types of socialists as well, heading towards a 24-mark question. I'll remind you about that in a moment. Okay, so what we started with in... There we go. What we started with was this picture, and most people grasped straight away that this was Lenin, or at least a statue of Lenin, in an Eastern European country. This one happens to be Romania. And I put this on because I was reminding students that in 1990, after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union, and what were called communist countries in the Eastern European, Eastern Bloc, most people thought that was it for socialism. Socialism's dead. And indeed, I was at university in 1991, and there was a course called Marxism since 1917, and that I wanted to sign up to it, and the lecturer refused to run it because he said, well, nobody's going to talk about that anymore. Those ideas are dead. Fast forward to 2020, and here we've got Bernie Sanders, a self-declared socialist, AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a self-declared socialist as well, and both of them being emblematic of the fact that socialism has made something of a comeback. Lots of people in America even call themselves socialists, and we've had a revival of socialism in other countries in Europe and around the world as well. And so Corbynism might be a failed project as far as the election was concerned, but there's still hundreds of thousands of socialists there. Podemos in Spain, Syriza in Greece, similar alternative left-wing movements in other countries in Europe as well. So what's going on? Why is it that something which was dead and buried 30 years ago appears to have made something of a comeback? It might be to do with some of these facts. We talked about these briefly. I'm not going to talk about them a lot right now, but one of the things that's happened that people are more aware of is inequality. And the greater concentrations of wealth in the hands of billionaires is at the expense of continued levels of poverty, and indeed a widening gap between rich and poor, the widest gap between rich and poor that we've probably ever had. Certainly income disparity in the UK is greater now than it has been at any time since the 1890s. And lots of that's happened in the last 30 years. So the rich have got much richer, much more quickly in the last 30 years. And the poor, if they haven't got richer, have certainly not got better off at the same rate. This is a staggering statistic, I think, this one in the middle. 2,000 billionaires own and control as much wealth as about 60% of the world's population. And socialists would argue, I guess, that what that means is there's plenty to go around. It's just that it happens to be distributed wrongly. It happens to be concentrated in the hands of too few people. And those people are busy stacking it up in bank accounts, not spending it, or spending it on things like super yachts, which nobody else can get the benefit from. Whereas if those other 4.5 billion people had that money, they'd be putting it to much better use in terms of childcare, education, employment, and people's general well-being. Okay, so that also led me then to explain why I think there are probably four key features, four key reasons why there is this moment that's happening now over the last 30 years that socialism's becoming more popular. One of them is to do with the crash in 2008, because preceding the crash from about the late 1970s up until the beginning of the 2000s, we had, it wasn't unbroken, but we had long periods of economic growth. punctuated by consumer booms. And if there were dips, the dips didn't last very, very long. But 2008 was a massive crash and what most people think of as a market failure. Left to its own devices, with the invisible hand of the market regulating finance and regulating banking, it didn't retain an equilibrium. What it did was eat itself by loaning out too much money to people who couldn't possibly pay it back because they were paid too little in the labour market. And that led people to think, wow, maybe capitalism isn't the answer, and maybe we need some sort of alternative. That became more clear with the second thing that has led socialism to be more popular, and that was the way in which governments responded to that 2008 crash. Because what we saw was bailouts, but only for the bankers. And those bailouts, so billions of pounds and billions of dollars, were paid for with taxpayers' money and by cutting back public services and cutting back things like benefits, public sector pay, education, health and infrastructure, selling off other things to the market as well. So for about 10 years, public sector workers in this country, for example, have had a pay freeze. Tell me about it. I know. And therefore a real terms decline in pay. So for the first time, we're talking about people growing up, children growing up, who expect to be less well off than their parents. And that's led people to question whether capitalism, certainly free market capitalism, should be allowed to carry on. One of the things that people have also questioned is the liberal free market idea that we get peace through trade, that we simply let the market run and let people kind of reciprocate with each other and establish trade relations like the European Union or something similar. What that's going to lead to is what Francis Fukuyama, a liberal that we talked about very briefly last term, called the end of history. No more wars, no more conflict. And yet actually what we can see is the opposite to that. We've seen the rise of China, trade wars with Europe, trade wars with America. Maybe they'll turn into real physical wars. And at the same time, the rise of other rival imperial powers, rival empires, rival countries. Russia would be a really good example. The rise of Saudi Arabia and other Middle Eastern giants as well, threatening stability. And so people think, well, if capitalism can't even maintain peace, then maybe there should be some sort of alternative. And then lastly, and most recently, we could make an argument that we're all socialists now. In the COVID crisis, the response this time to an economic crisis and a health crisis and pandemic was not to roll back the state, but to expand the state massively as well. And so Corbyn's budget in the 2009 manifesto, which looked for lots of people as really too radical and the most left-wing manifesto that Labour had ever made, has been eclipsed by Rishi Sunak. There's Rishi Sunak's little face there. Rishi Sunak's COVID budget, in which they've all, up to this point, ploughed in something like £750 billion, mainly borrowed, mainly paid for by taxpayers, to expand, to provide things like free money to workers, like a universal basic income, but even greater in some instances, or to cancel homelessness overnight by using taxpayers' money to put homeless people in emergency shelters and indeed hotels as well. And we could argue that since the state now is the answer to things rather than the problem, it means that even conservative parties have adopted some features, not principles, I guess, but some features of things that look a bit like socialism. So clearly it's having a moment. That leads us then to talk about, well, what is this thing called socialism after all? And here, because this is a kind of quick recap explainer thing, I have no intention of playing this for you. But what I did in the session this morning was play this tune. I just played 2 very quick seconds of it. It's by Alex Glasgow. There you go. And what Alex does, is a folk singer from the Northeast, is sing the ABC of socialism. And what you have in Classroom is this little template. It's a little bit small, so I'll just make that bigger. Is this template, and I can't make it bigger. And the idea is you're going to listen to the song and try and fill in as many of the letters, A, B, C, and so on, as you can, because each of these words has got something to do with socialism. And that bit of fun, bit of nonsense, should lead us to have an understanding of some of the vocabulary of socialism, some of the things you'll know already. And then what I asked people to do was write a definition of what they think we mean by socialism, because we talked about some things some problems with capitalism and some things we think we might mean by it. But this got people scratching their heads about, okay, well, what is socialism really? Some of the things that people came up with were redistribution of wealth. So kind of what people could talk about often as Robin Hood politics, that we take money from people who've got too much of it and we redistribute it, maybe through taxation or through some other means, to people who've got very little of it. So second thing then, equality is one of the features of socialism. That instead of having massive inequalities between rich and poor people, which then also lead to power inequalities because rich people get to tell poor people what to do, or rich people get to sack poor people, or so on. If we had more economic equality, then that would be a society in which people were freer to do what they want as well. We talked about the state and nationalisation, and that can be an example, where we talk about equality. Often that's achieved by collective ownership of factories or collective ownership of wealth, and that might take place through the state. So we have a health service which we all own, belongs to all of us, not to some private medical companies yet. And that might be seen as a feature of socialism as well. So there are some key words in there which are beginning to build up our vocabulary of what we mean by socialism. Okay, quick little overview of how we're going to treat this topic over the next 12 lessons or so, including this one. We're always going to start with these 4 things in the middle. I put here differences among socialists around core ideas, but actually what I really should have said is things that they agree on. Because when we're writing a 24-mark question, one of the things we're trying to do in the first paragraph is say, look, if it says to what extent do different socialists disagree about the role of the state, well, the first paragraph is going to be about all the ways in which they agree, and that question could be about the state, or it could be about human nature, or it could be about the economy and society. So our first 4 lessons here are going to be about ways in which they agree with each other, including today about human society. And tomorrow is about human nature, rather. Tomorrow is about society and class. Next week about the economy and the state. After we've done that, we'll begin to think about different types of socialists. And so you can see there we're looking at revolutionary socialists, democratic socialists, social democrats, and the third way, and the way in which to talk about socialism isn't just one thing. So there are some really big differences. And just as with liberalism and conservatism, it's true that some of the differences are so big that it's sometimes difficult to see why we call them all the same ideology at all. Just like the other sets of ideas, there are 5 key thinkers here, which the examiners are expecting you to look at. There are lots and lots of other people who call themselves socialists, but these are the 5 that we'll write about in order to illustrate those different strands. So Marx and Engels, Luxemburg, Beatrice Webb, Tony Crossland, and Tony Gibbons. And then there's some key vocabulary. I've already mentioned some of this vocabulary as well, and we'll come back to that later. All right, so our main job today was to think about this thing, about human nature. And let's think about it now. We normally talk about human nature as being the way in which people think and behave. And if you remember looking at liberalism and conservatism, they had some clear ideas about it. Conservatives, for example, thought that human nature was based upon an original sin, but left to our own devices, without the parenting of the state or the authority of a king or ruler, we'd all kill each other or be really horrible to each other. It would be, as Hobbes described it, a war of all against all. So therefore, any kind of egalitarian society is likely to be very unfeasible. Liberals, on the other hand, had a very more optimistic view of human nature, but only in so much as individuals were basically selfish, but they understood that other individuals are selfish, and if we understood our own self-interest and understood that other people had their own self-interest, then we'd reciprocate with each other and we'd trade with each other and allow each other to get on the business of trying to get rich and do the things that we want to do. Both of these are based on fixed ideas of human nature. And the big difference for socialists, the way in which all socialists agree, is that human nature is not one fixed thing. And for this, we can make use of our friend Karl Marx here. There he is, looking a bit like Santa. Karl Marx has this brilliant phrase, social being determines social consciousness. So think for a minute about human nature as social consciousness, the way we think, the way we act, the way we behave towards each other. What Marx is saying is that whether we have a good human nature or a nasty human nature, like a liberal or a conservative human nature, isn't just fixed, isn't just something we're born with, actually it depends upon the sort of society we're living in. And what Marx was arguing was that societies change over time. So the way in which human beings behaved towards each other 2,000 years ago or 1,500 years ago is not the same as the way in which human beings behave towards each other now. But also different places. One of the things that socialists would argue is that before we had the sort of society we've got now, capitalist society, or even before that, before feudal society and slave societies, we had a society which was classless, a pre-class society. And in that society, much less sophisticated, obviously, it's what Engels called, in a fairly un-PC term, primitive communism. What we'd have is hunter-gatherer bands. And those hunter-gatherer bands, like here, would share everything in common, be non-hierarchical, not have any leaders, not seek to acquire private property and compete with each other. Indeed, competition would often be alien to them, but to work out everything collectively as well. And by that means, be freer to have more time because there was no division of labour and they shared all the work in common. It wasn't just some people being idle while the rest of everybody else did the work for them. Gender relations were more egalitarian because all the other jobs were shared in common. And the way in which family relationships were different as well, because all the children were seen as the children of the whole group rather than the children, sort of private property that you are of your parents. You belong to your children, but these children belong to everybody in the group. So Engels wrote about this in The Origins of the Family, Private Property and the State. Other anthropologists were working then in the 19th century and even indeed now to demonstrate that there are also groups which behave a bit like this now. So for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, the Gongsan, which is a hunter-gatherer nomadic group, or a series of nomadic groups actually, have lots of these characteristics: non-hierarchical, non-competitive, no actual ownership of private property, children more or less shared in common as well. And these have profound impacts on the way in which people behave towards each other, unlike the capitalist society in which we live now. Okay, so in that, I've also put this little article. I think, I make no apologies here that if you want to find out what socialism is all about, then ask a socialist. And so this article comes from Socialist Worker. So if you want to see a little bit more about what I was just talking about there, about anthropology and the way in which the way in which anthropologists have looked at different societies apart from the one that we're living in to show how human nature might actually be contingent upon the sort of society people live in, then that's not a bad place to start. Okay. So if it's the case that social being determines social consciousness, what socialists can argue is that if we change society, that's going to change human nature. That's going to change the way in which people behave towards each other. So we talked about this a little bit in the session this morning, that what would happen then if all property was collectively owned and we didn't have private property? How would people behave differently? Well, for one thing, we might not be as acquisitive as we are. We might not compete with each other to get the latest consumer goods or the latest consumer brands. We might not be so susceptible to advertising that comes from those privately owned corporations which want us to buy things for the sake of buying things rather than simply because it might be useful to us as well. And indeed, if we collectively owned the factories that produce this stuff, we might make more rational decisions about what was produced. So instead of producing 70 different types of washing powder, for example, we might be more inventive and more creative about putting that kind of science and that kind of manufacture to other good uses. The yellow one, I think, we'll come back to maybe the distribution of resources one another time, but the yellow one, I think, is quite useful, interesting, because again, that's the idea about collective childcare, changing the way in which people behave, changing their view of human nature. And there are examples of this in Eastern Europe and in Russia, where children are brought up collectively in nurseries so that they don't see the private family home, that private sphere, as their most important bit of identity, but instead are much more likely to see each other outside of the home as brothers and sisters, and therefore be less alienated towards each other, more likely to have a kind of solidarity with those people that they've been at nursery with and so on. Okay. So I've left this as a kind of thinking exercise, I suppose. What would be the arguments against this? If you wanted to argue that human nature is impossible, how would you make it? So I left this as a thinking exercise for you, I suppose. There's John Lennon singing Imagine, and the lyrics to Imagine provide an idea, I suppose, of what a socialist society might look like. Imagine there's no war, and so on. So what would be the arguments against this? How would socialists try and defend this? We didn't get to this in the session itself, but you could think about this. Why couldn't child poverty and homelessness be abolished? And if they could, then why haven't we done it by now? Well, what about this one? About pay. It's often the thing that people are most precious about. But why shouldn't brain surgeons and hospital cleaners be paid the same? It's quite a good time to look at this, of course, because we've been focusing on key workers. And what we've understood is there are some people in the economy and some people in society whose job is pretty much redundant. We really don't need advertising executives. And we really don't need estate agents. We really don't need lots of other people who make their wealth by profiting from the work of other people. We really do need doctors and brain surgeons. We really do need hospital cleaners. So if we pay people according to their social worth rather than the amount of time they put into going to university, and if those people themselves weren't interested in acquiring wealth for the sake of it because they were competing against other people, but got their reward from contributing something to society, there might be an argument for actually increasing the pay of hospital cleaners a great deal. And maybe brain surgeons might not feel as though they would need to be paid as much. Okay. So a quick recap on what we talked about in this session. One, socialists think there is no such thing as fixed human nature. And that's because we've got evidence that people behave differently in different times and places. That means that if we're not very nice to each other now, the flaws that we have now, that's not our fault. That's not built in. There's not a problem with human beings that stops us having a nicer, better society. Those things are features of capitalism, and they're part of the reason why capitalism carries on like it does, but also part of the reason why we should get rid of capitalism. And having got rid of capitalism, one of the reasons why creating a socialist society might make a better sort of society. Okay. That, I think, is all for now. Hopefully, while you've been doing this, you've been rolling along with this handout and trying to make your own notes. That's all this is for, right? It's not an exercise, it's not a homework exercise or anything like that. Even if it appears as an assignment on Classroom, that's just so I could make a copy for each of you. In this case, it's just a way of making notes while we've been covering this bit of the lesson. So we've defined what socialism is, and we've talked about only one of its core ideas, that is human nature. And we'll look at the three other core ideas that socialists agree on in the next 3 lessons. So, okay, as usual, any problems, email me, get in touch, and I'll try and answer any questions for you as well. Okay, see you next time.